Muslim Americans are our neighbors. If nothing else, that is what I wish to impress upon people today. They run our small businesses and sometimes big businesses. They pay taxes and worry about making rent. They go to school and pray and ask about our days. They are our neighbors. There are approximately 3.5 million Muslims living in the United States today, the third largest religion in the nation. To give some impression of those numbers, that is greater than the population of Wyoming, Vermont, Delaware, and Alaska combined. They have been a part of this nation roughly since its birth, and they have a greater role in the nation today. Islam is as much a part of the identity of the United States as anything else that comes to mind when one thinks of America. Yet, in spite of this, Islam has also been historically labeled irreconcilable with American values and its people unassimilable into American culture. A clash of civilizations, an abstract and unseen conflict brewing beneath the surface, at least in the minds of those who have bought into this, or those who wish to sell this conflict to the masses for their own reasons. The proposal that Islam is irreconcilable with American values is based on a narrow vision of what it means to be an American and what it means to embody American values. The values of the people of the United States of America are not only numerous but vary depending on region, political affiliation, religion, and more. Values are cultural, and even within a culture, values tend to vary greatly. To say that Muslim Americans do not share American values is a way of excluding Muslim Americans from the culture, even though their values are as equally valid within the United States as, say, a white Christian's values are. An individual conception of a set of values within a given space or culture always excludes values that are deemed in contradiction to the individual's preference of what those values ought to be, instead of a recognition of those allegedly contradictory values. If one believes that American values are merely values by majority consensus, and that anyone living outside of this consensus can be excluded from the rights and protections of the United States, then this leads us down a dangerous path of disallowing the rights and protections of Americans deemed degenerate by the majority. This fear of Islam replacing the values or the people of a nation is often called Islamophobia. Much like any form of bigotry, Islamophobia is conducted, arguably, in two ways: individual Islamophobia and systemic Islamophobia. Individual Islamophobia is the personal fear, rhetoric, and actions of a single person. An individual may not even consider themselves an Islamophobe while using Islamophobic language, sidestepping outright explicit hatred with rhetoric that diverts the conversation. An Islamophobe does not have to yell that they hate Muslims to be Islamophobic. They can, instead, substitute this more egregious statement by saying they are merely concerned about the dilution of Western culture. This allows for a crypto-Islamophobia and for this rhetoric to be accepted by society at large, thereby causing harm to Muslims not in the margins of a far-right anti-Islam rally, but in the mainstream instead. Systemic Islamophobia refers to how this concern interacts among people within a society and within the law. Individual Islamophobia draws from the broader systemic Islamophobia. A prejudice does not form in a vacuum. An Islamophobe does not become an Islamophobe without being influenced by a society that sold them this concept through social interaction, through media, through political rhetoric, or through the law. Islamophobia is more complicated than a one-sentence definition in a dictionary, and more complex than mere individual prejudice. Furthermore, criticism of a tenet of Islam or an individual Muslim is not necessarily Islamophobic. It depends on the rhetoric and the goals of that rhetoric. The goal of actual Islamophobic rhetoric is to other Muslims as irreconcilable and unassimilable. On an individual level, Islamophobic rhetoric does not interrogate the merits of someone who happens to be Muslim, but interrogates the merits of someone because they are a Muslim. On a systemic level, Islamophobic rhetoric does not interrogate the merits of a tenet that happens to be of Islam, but because it is of Islam. Such rhetoric ignores how the same tenets or similar tenets can just as easily be found in other religions and other cultures, often including the religion or culture of the person performing the rhetoric. Muslims are most likely to report religious discrimination among the various faiths. Non-Muslims might mistakenly believe that this is only leftover hostility from the George W. Bush administration, but the truth is more complicated. Muslims have been part of the American experiment since its birth, but there has also always been an attempt to marginalize and demonize Muslims. These questions need to be answered. How did systemic Islamophobia develop in the United States? How does Islamophobia intersect with race and class? What can we do to fight both individual and systemic Islamophobia? And how can non-Muslims be better allies? As with most things, we must start at the very beginning. The proposal of Islam being irreconcilable with the United States has some of its history in the European representation of the Middle East and Asian societies as culturally opposed to the West. This is accomplished through exaggeration, romanticization, and condemnation of a region described as inferior by imperialist powers in Europe. This is often called Orientalism. When the New World of the Americas was colonized by Europeans, the concepts of Orientalism and Western superiority came with them. The idea of Islam being irreconcilable with the United States ignores centuries of Muslim American history and whitewashes how Islam has been purposefully hidden in the broader history of the nation. According to the author of A History of Islam in America, from the time Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic, West and North Africans served as involuntary servants to Europeans arriving in the Americas. The early history of Muslims in what would eventually be the United States is, tragically, a history of slavery. Islamophobes today, upon hearing this, see this as an opportunity to marginalize Muslim suffering, stating that powerful rulers in Africa and Middle Eastern history, some of whom were Muslims, also had slaves themselves. However, as should be obvious, this is an attempt to bind all Muslims to a kind of racial crime or cultural crime that condemns Muslim victims as well as perpetrators, with their only connection being Islam. An ugly and ignorant belief that a poor Muslim gets what he deserves due to the unrelated historical crimes of a rich Muslim he has never met. This conflation is common among Islamophobes whenever a crime happens to be committed by a Muslim. By the time the first Africans were captured and deported to the Americas, Islam had already been well established in much of Africa. Although we cannot know exactly how many African slaves in the Americas were Muslims, studies have shown that approximately 46% of slaves in the antebellum South were captured from Africa's western region, which had a significant Muslim population. The concept of Orientalism created a limited understanding of Muslim identity, especially as it pertained to race. Muslim was synonymous with Arab or Middle Eastern. The religion was reworked by the imaginations of Europeans and early Americans as a racial identity. Slave had already been racialized as African. If African meant slave and Muslim meant Arab or Middle Eastern, then an African Muslim was both legally and culturally contradictory in early American history. This racialization of Islam, even though Islam is a religion and not a race, is why Muslims are nonetheless subject to racism. This racialized concept of Islam, combined with the purposeful obfuscation of the faith of slaves, erased the Muslim identity of many slaves. The initial faith of slaves was largely ignored, as that would humanize them. Slaves were not allowed to retain their identities. American-born children of African Muslims were taught Christianity, not Islam. This annihilation of culture marginalized the open practice of Islam in the United States for a long time. This was the earliest form of systemic Islamophobia in the United States, but it was not the last. Article 1 of the United States Constitution granted Congress the power to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Only a few months after ratification, Congress limited naturalization to any alien being a free white person who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for a term of 2 years. After the Civil War, the white person restriction was interrogated, but many in Congress argued against removing the restriction. Eventually, Congress maintained the white person language, but also included persons of African nativity or African descent. However, Muslims of African descent drew greater scrutiny and were almost always rejected, and Muslims of Middle Eastern or Asian descent were banned from naturalization altogether. According to the author of American Islamophobia, during the naturalization era, immigrants seeking citizenship were bound by the prerequisite of being found to be free white persons by a civil court. However, what defined whiteness was not allowed to extend beyond Christianity, and especially Protestantism, and Islam stood as its rival, and thus was considered irreconcilable with whiteness. Muslim identity precluded one from being deemed white by law, and therefore eligible for citizenship. It was not until the middle of the 20th century before the United States began allowing more Muslims to enter its borders. But this was not the result of some moral epiphany about the past treatment of Muslims. Instead, this happened because of the United States' growing competition with the Soviet Union. The naturalization of Arab Muslim immigrants was part of the United States' outreach into economically important regions, particularly the Middle East and its oil reserves. The Naturalization Act was officially in effect until 1952, hundreds of years after Muslims were first captured and taken to the United States. Of course, this self-serving economic decision by the United States was not the end of Islamophobia within its borders. Finally allowing Muslim naturalization in the United States, as well as naturalization of other previously unassimilable people, was a direct result of the beginning of the Cold War. American identity during the Cold War relied on a performative hatred of the Soviet Union and communism. It established the patriotism of the citizens to condemn this foreign power that threatened those ill-defined American values. In truth, the Cold War was a conflict of controlling economic interest and global hegemony, not values. The values were merely the public face of it. During the Cold War, the United States and its allies staged coups in Middle Eastern nations to prop up leaders that were more friendly to U.S. economic interests, such as in Syria, Egypt, and most famously, Iran. These regime changes were done in secret by intelligence agencies, but following the Cold War, the United States was free to be more openly and publicly aggressive. With the fall of the Soviet Union, the United States had no other superpower standing in the way of global hegemony, and no other superpower who could challenge them on their foreign policy goals in the Middle East. The United States now had a new antagonist, one that its people had already been told for centuries was antithetical to American values and unassimilable into American culture. That assured very little pushback from the public. Naturally, the people of these nations objected to being controlled by the West, with Americans simply under the mistaken impression that any hostility between the United States and the Middle East is because Muslims hate our freedom. They easily accepted incidents like the Iran hostage crisis as apolitical and the result of a clash of civilizations. According to the author of Islamophobia and Racism in America, another crucial moment in the development of the dangerous Middle Eastern stereotype came during the 1979 Iran hostage crisis. The American embassy in Tehran was seized by gun-toting revolutionaries who then held the embassy staff hostage for 14 months. Television news showed these Islamic revolutionaries on a daily basis. It is difficult to overstate how much this national crisis contributed to the shift away from the Middle Eastern oil sheik stereotype toward the terrorist stereotype. Indeed, the word terrorist became fully synonymous with Middle Easterners by the mid-1980s. Of course, terrorist attacks were carried out by all kinds of militants throughout the 1970s and 1980s, but attacks by Middle Easterners attracted perhaps the most sustained attention in the United States. It's important to understand that Islamophobia in the United States is not simply the result of individual conflation with terrorists, but the result of United States foreign policy. The people of a nation during times of war often turn their animus towards those inside their own borders who resemble or share an ethnic background with enemy combatants. This is not only carried out by the citizenry through private individual prejudice, but through state-sponsored actions. This is especially true in the United States because it is constantly at war, either publicly or in secret. During World War II, Japanese Americans were forcibly interned in camps. Following the events of 9/11, Islamophobia reached a new peak in the United States. About a week after the attack, President George W. Bush told the nation that this was the world's fight, that this was civilization's fight, the fight of all who believe in progress and pluralism, tolerance and freedom. He told us that the civilized world is rallying to America's side, and that we were in a fight for our principles. Once again, the state tied the conflict as one of principles, of values, not of politics or foreign policy. Although not explicitly stated, the message received by much of the American public was that the United States was now at war with the Muslim world, and that any Muslims living in the U.S. would have to prove their loyalty. Defenders of Bush might claim that he once said that Islam is peace, and that he never outright told the citizenry to discriminate, harass, or assault Muslim Americans. However, that is generally not how rhetoric accomplishes its goals, and incitement does not require unambiguous directions. More importantly, the actions of the state during the Bush administration told a different story. Again from the book American Islamophobia. This war is dramatically distinct from its predecessors, and unlike conventional wars in general, its target is not a nation-state or empire, but rather the vague and amorphous concept of terrorism, conflated with Islam and the billions of its believers presumed to be sympathetic to or in cahoots with terror. The state has linked Muslims, whether immigrants or citizens, living in the United States or abroad, to the suspicion of terrorism, and it has formally enacted a two-front war: the foreign war and the surveillance, policing, and cultural wars deployed within the country. In addition to the highest rise in Islamophobic hate crimes in the history of the nation, post-9/11 politics targeted Muslim Americans on a systemic level. NSEERS, or National Security Entry and Exit Registration System, was a predominantly Muslim immigrant registry that existed for 14 years throughout the Bush and Obama administrations. 24 of the 25 countries of interest listed in the NSEERS legislation were Muslim-majority nations. CVE, or Countering Violent Extremism, is a Department of Homeland Security task force that spies on mosques and Muslim communities in the United States, recruits Muslims hoping to alleviate their own suspicion by spying on their neighbors, and generally violates the civil rights of Muslim Americans on a regular basis. CVE programs are built on the foundation of two lies. First, that there is some easily understood process of terrorist radicalization, and second, that many Muslims are simply terrorists in waiting, and that if exposed to subject matter or people that CVE programs find offensive, they will be sure to bomb and otherwise terrorize non-Muslim Americans, as if it were their destiny. Not only is this ignorant on its face, but 2 decades of empirical research has disproved it all. Not only is Muslim faith a poor predictor of terrorism, but even Muslims who hold beliefs that CVE programs would find extreme almost never commit violent terrorism. CVE programs see potential terrorists in Muslims who express political grievances. In other words, Muslim Americans who speak out against their own oppression are labeled potential terrorists and are intimidated into silence. CVE programs drive a wedge in these communities between those who reluctantly cooperate with the state in their own oppression and those who refuse to cooperate altogether. And since much of what CVE informants are told is mere political grievances and not actual terrorist plots, the wedge being driven is not helpful to their communities and is not offset by any significant gains or any significant number of uncovered plots. As the vast majority of Muslim Americans are in ethnic minority groups that have been historically marginalized, and a great number of them are immigrants, Muslim Americans experience poverty more often than other major religious demographics in the United States. This decreases their resources when it comes to mounting a legal defense against disproportionate targeting and unfair treatment by the state. While the Patriot Act and the War on Terror were the signature Islamophobic programs of the Bush administration, CVE is the signature Islamophobic program of the Obama administration. None of this ended after Bush. It only got worse over time. The signature Islamophobic program of the Trump administration was undoubtedly the Muslim travel ban. During Trump's campaign, he promised to ban all Muslims from entering the United States. This was widely condemned and dismissed during his campaign as tough talk that would not amount to anything. 1 week after his inauguration, Trump signed an executive order banning entry into the United States from 7 Muslim-majority countries. Apologists for Trump claimed that he had not banned Muslims but merely any foreign national from Muslim-majority countries. However, his previous statement that his goal was to ban Muslims made his intentions unambiguous. There is no intellectually honest way to defend the Muslim travel ban as somehow being neutral or not targeting Muslims. The consequences of a policy provide far more insight into the intentions of the policy than the wording of said policy. More importantly, the consequences of a policy are materially more important than the intentions of the policy anyway. Unlike Bush and Obama, who paid some lip service to the Muslim American community amid their policies that directly targeted them, Trump was comfortable being more openly bigoted, which undoubtedly had an effect on the rise in hate crimes against Muslim Americans during his administration. Individual Islamophobic sentiment also increased simply due to the emergence of Muslim American politicians like Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib. One might argue that the mere existence of elected Muslim representatives in Congress might be a sign that Islamophobia is on the decline, but the House is chosen through districts, not by the nation at large. Omar represents the 5th District of Minnesota, an area which has one of the largest Somali diasporas in the United States. Tlaib represents the 13th District of Michigan, which contains Detroit, a minority-majority city. The demographics are not as helpful for potential Muslim American politicians throughout most of the United States. So now that we understand how systemic Islamophobia developed in the United States, and how Islamophobia intersects with both race and class, what can we do to push back against it? Solidarity with Muslim Americans benefits all Americans. A united front against individual bigots, violent far-right groups, and state oppression is useful to all of us. Individual bigots and violent far-right groups that traffic in Islamophobia also traffic in a spectrum of other bigoted beliefs and target a number of marginalized groups. There is often spillover that can even affect people normally privileged enough to be unaffected. State oppression as it relates to Islamophobia also tends to impact non-Muslims through increased police presence, violation of civil liberties, and an uptick in state surveillance, all of which are tenuously justified through the public's fear of Muslims. Being better allies to Muslims begins with educating ourselves on the subject of Islamophobia, and although this video is a good starting point, the books cited and quoted throughout the video contain additional information. There are also a number of organizations that work to track hate groups and defend marginalized people like the American Civil Liberties Union, the Southern Poverty Law Center, and the NAACP. Joining or contributing to them helps further their causes. When conservative politicians introduce pointless anti-Sharia law legislation, we can demonstrate against this, as well as use this against these politicians when they're up for re-election. When we see Islamophobic hate speech on social media, we can report it and/or confront it. All these resources and more can be found in the description. Solidarity, in a sense, means being better neighbors to one another. And remember, Muslim Americans are our neighbors.